Good morning, everyone. My name is Joan Mealy McCarthy, and I am speaking to you from not so sunny Maryland this morning. I'm right outside of Annapolis. I am Executive Director of the Summit School, a school for bright children with learning differences in grades 1 through 8. And I am here to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is oral language and executive functions. So we will go through the presentation. It will have to be kind of like speed dating because there's so much information and I have condensed it. But please feel free to ask questions at the end of the presentation. So here we go. So we're going to talk about today executive functions in oral language and pieces in the puzzle of academic achievement. I am by training a speech language pathologist and also have credentials as a teacher of the speech and hearing disordered out of New York, even though I do live in Maryland. So I do have not just a clinical background in speech language pathology, but also an academic background, having served in the schools for quite a while, and have been a student of understanding children with respect to when they don't do well academically, what is it and how does their oral language affect their academic difficulties. When we started as a profession looking at executive functions in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we knew about it from traumatic brain injury, but we weren't really talking about it from looking at children in school and how they were doing. And we have really come such a long way in our understanding of executive functions and academic achievement, and now oral language, how oral language just is a part of that big picture. So I know that if you've been in schools or if you have children, there are many kids whose diagnostic data do not predict the difficulties they face in school. They might test within the average range, maybe the lower end of the average range. They might get A's and B's, but they struggle and it comes hard for them. And many times the cause for this unexpected difficulty are weak executive functions. So today we're going to have a very brief review about executive functions, and then we'll engage in a conversation about oral language and the relationship that oral language has to executive functions. And what I'm really going to ask you is to think about things in a different way. There are probably many things or most things that I'm going to share with you that you say, yeah, I know that, but I want you to think about it a little bit differently so that you can look at some students who really seem to struggle and their test scores don't give you a clue, or they're not weak enough to reflect the level of difficulty they have with school, with certain content areas in school. So this is an opportunity for us to think flexibly and to think differently. And then we'll talk about a few instructional strategies that are helpful for students with executive function difficulties. And those are specifically going to be some of the things that we use here at the Summit School. So first, let's talk about EF red flags, and I'll just shorten executive functions to EF. So allow me that thing to do. I don't know, just allow me that so that it's a little shorter. So learning requisites. The first thing we're going to talk about is we know that a lot of times children with executive functioning difficulties really perform well through grade 5 and then they start to struggle. In the past 10 years, I think that we know a lot more about executive functions and we're starting to see it in the preschool years. But typically, children tend to do better in an elementary school. Elementary school teachers are very nurturing. They serve as the child's surrogate frontal lobe. And so it's not until they get to 5th grade and the teacher says, you should be able to do this on your own. And as Martha Dankla has said, doing something on your own can be a death knell for children with executive functions. A lot of times these kids demonstrate poor attentional stamina, they have poor homework compliance, poor initiation of tasks, they sit there and just can't get started, generally disorganized, it takes a long time to do homework, or they don't do homework at all, or they think they know what to do when they leave the class, but then by the time they get home, they've forgotten exactly what they had to do. They may get stressed, not all of them, but some children become anxious. Some of them shut down with frustration. Many of these kids have been called lazy, and many may demonstrate difficulty with flexible thinking or with academic tasks that require flexibility. So specifically, when we look at the academic concerns, The presenting concern a lot of times is reading comprehension. But for me as a speech pathologist, I would do a battery of oral language tests and they would do okay. And I would do the typical reading tests and they would do okay. But nevertheless, when they had to read a journal article or when they had to read a textbook, they could not take all of that information and use it to think, use it to reason, or use it for writing. Often children with executive functioning difficulties have good splinter skills. In other words, they get the code, they get the alphabetic code, they might understand the phonics, they might understand the orthography of spelling, they might understand how to do addition and subtraction, they might understand capitalization and punctuation, but as soon as you put it into a whole, into one big picture, they make errors, they start to struggle. A lot of times kids with EF difficulties dislike writing, they often display disorganized oral and or written language. And it's this disorganization of oral language that I think is a key to really understanding the internal disorganization some of these kids have. A lot of times these children know a lot of information, but they don't perform well on tests. And in fact, they don't perform well on school. And some of these kids just can't do school. I was talking to a set of parents yesterday whose child is so bright, but that whole executive system of his is really weak and really requires strong scaffolding from teachers. And so you can imagine that this guy who has so much information, knows a lot of information, went into our pandemic virtual learning situation and just fell apart. And then teachers really had to scaffold him a lot to keep him on the path. Many times children with executive functioning difficulties forget multi-step math calculations, so long division, it's a hard stop right there, or dividing fractions, it's a hard stop, even though they understand the concepts underlying them. They struggle with multi-step word problems in math. And then we say, okay, so what does the term weak executive functions mean? And what does it actually mean with respect to school achievement? So often kids who have weak executive functions have difficulty with all or some of these. Teaching styles, adapting to different teaching styles, different rules of different teachers is really hard. So in elementary school, typically there's one teacher or maybe two. So they don't have a lot of adapting to do. But once they get to middle school and they're changing classes, it's really hard. Holding on to large chunks of verbal information, either at the oral or print levels, is difficult. So when participating in a pretty complex academic conversation, sometimes those verbal bits of information just escape them. And it's very hard for them to hold on to it and participate in the conversation, or to come in timely, or to remember what they want to say after they have their hand up. And certainly when we look at reading, when it's large sections of reading with lots of complex information, it's just too hard to hold on to. Kids with EF difficulties also have a hard time conceptualizing, planning, implementing a research report. You say, we're going to do a research report on the causes of World War II, and that is just so big. They can't figure out what are the steps I need to take to get the information, to organize the information, and then to paraphrase the information, and then to put it into a report with my thoughts. And I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. And very typically, performing tasks that have multiple layers is very difficult. So spontaneous writing is difficult. So while their oral language might be okay, their spelling for single word spelling tests might be okay. They might be able to tell you all the rules for capitalization and punctuation, and they might write single sentences beautifully. When they go to put that together in a spontaneous writing context, a lot of those things that they know as splinter skills just fall apart. Now the question is, you might ask, but why? And how does oral language play into the concepts of executive functions? Well, I'm going to bring you back to the old school diagram that I was taught way back when I was training undergraduate and graduate in speech language pathology. And we look at inner receptive, expressive language. And then expressive language can either be oral or written. For a speech language pathologist, I'm mainly looking at the oral and then how it displays in the written. But I do want to go back to looking at inner language, and that's your cognitive schemas. That's what you know about the world. So if you go into a household in a country that's where the language is foreign to you, you still know what a stove is, and you still have that internal knowledge of stove, what it does, and you have your internal language for it. So that's inner language. And then receptive is how you understand it. So you understand the word for stove. If someone in your own language said stove to you, you would understand it. But if someone who spoke a language that you don't speak said it, you might not have receptive language for it. And if you don't have receptive language for it, your expressive language is not going to be there. So at a certain point, we would just talk about, what is your inner language, your cognitive schema? How does it build then to receptive language, understanding the terms and words in your language, and then how do you express it? But I think inner language now has a more deeper meaning. And so we look at inner language as being self-talk. And if you think about when you're doing something complex and you think about when you're following the steps, there's a lot of inner self-talk that you use as you're working yourself through. When you look at children first learning a skill, they will talk their way through it. Or if they're doing something difficult in elementary school, you'll see at their desk, they will do a lot of self-talk. And sometimes it's not quiet. Sometimes it's verbal. But inner talk is really self-talk and has a big play for executive functions because it helps regulate us. This is also a blast from the past for a speech language pathologist from Bloom and Leahy in 1980, and this tells us about oral language knowledge. So when we look at the form of language, phonology, spelling, syntax, grammar, and we look about the content, all the different ways we can look at vocabulary and figurative language and how that plays into reading comprehension. And then we look at use, the social use of language. We know that all of those three interact and interconnect. And if there's a breakdown in one, then the other areas will also suffer. But this really reflects language knowledge. So there we have a schema for how language begins, inner, receptive, expressive, oral or expressive. We can understand oral language knowledge. And now we're going to look at some processing factors that really have a lot of play with oral language. So we look at word retrieval. Sometimes when children have language disorders, they can't retrieve the words they know. As we age, word retrieval becomes part of our language repertoire. Processing speed. If we're fast processors, we can understand language quickly. If we're slow processors, we can't. If we're fast processors, we can speak quickly. If we're slow processors, we can't. And if slow processing is interwoven with word retrieval, it's going to take you a long time to retrieve, think, organize your language. Working memory plays into that because you have to remember what you want to say in order to say something that is connected and in a discourse type of format. I talked about self-talk on the previous slide. And then the thing that I'm really thinking about in the past couple of years is flexibility. Really adept language users are flexible. So they're flexible in their vocabulary knowledge. They understand that there are grades of meaning with grades of vocabulary. So you can have little, you can have big, you can have huge, you can have tremendous. But if you don't have flexibility of that word knowledge and you can't retrieve it easily, you can't hone your message to say exactly what you want to say. And as I look at things, I think flexibility has a lot of play in the language system as it underpins the language that children need to do school. And then there is attention. If you can't pay attention all the time, you'll miss details. So attention plays into oral language processing as well. So this is a lot of words on the screen, and you have the PowerPoint in front of you. And these are the ways for us to think about executive functions. And they're the behavioral definitions. And the one that is most commonly difficult for children is working memory. So when children have executive functioning difficulties, working memory is really, really difficult. The next thing we go to is planning and organizing. It's hard for them to organize themselves and plan how to do a major project, plan how to write. Sometimes it's difficult to initiate an activity, and sometimes it's really hard to sustain an activity, to have that cognitive juice to do something until it's done. And for some children, they can't inhibit themselves. They act on impulse. So while you're writing, you say to yourself, oh, I have to remember to put this fact in. And you might write yourself a little note, but you'll continue to do what you're doing. But if you can't inhibit that impulse, you'll go and do what your thought process said, oh, I need to do this, and then forget to come back to where you were. So we look at these as the behavioral spectrum for executive functioning difficulties, and children have some of them, not all. If you were to look at them, you would say, I'm pretty strong here, but I'm not strong here. And I love to refer to these as isms. But when I look at them, I can also look at them with respect to language. And so working memory is really, really important in language. If you can't hold a lot of verbal information in your mind as you're listening or as you're writing, you're going to forget what was said, you're going to forget what you want to say, or you're going to forget what you want to write. Organizing oral language is the same as organizing written language. You have to be able to think about what you say, retrieve the words, and then organize the grammar and syntax in your sentence, and then sequence those sentences so they make sense. And planning goes right along with organizing. So you can think about oral language with respect to having enough working memory, enough ability to hold information in mind, and then organizing and planning. Initiating your oral language too can depend upon how well you can retrieve words and how well you can organize. When you look at children and ask them a question, and sometimes there's a 2 or 3 or 4 second delay, it's not because they don't know, it's because they can't necessarily retrieve and organize their language well. And if they can't do it orally, it's going to be really hard for them to do it when they're writing. The next thing I want to talk about is emotional control. So we know with executive functioning, when people get frustrated, sometimes they shut down, sometimes they just get too upset and can't continue. We call that amygdala hijack here at the Summit School. And we also see it with speaking. So if you get so emotionally wrought, you can't form your words. So that when children get very upset, maybe they have a little confrontation with a peer, or they're very upset because they can't understand something that's going on in the classroom. When you try to have a conversation with them in the moment, they can't because they're so emotionally wrought. You have to wait till all of those neurotransmitters recede, and then they can start to talk about why they were feeling so poorly. You have to be able to sustain a conversation. So children learn conversational turns early on. And so by the time they're 3 or 4 or 5, they can have a conversation with 3 or 4 or 5 conversational turns. But if you can't stick with it, then it sabotages your interpersonal relationships and your interpersonal interaction. The next thing I want to talk about is self-monitoring. As I'm talking to you, I'm monitoring what I'm saying, oh my goodness, I kind of stumbled over that word, or maybe I'm speaking too fast, or maybe I wasn't clear enough. And you do that online as you talk. Self-monitoring is part of our communication profile. The next thing I want to talk about is shifting. And this is that whole issue with flexibility. So if you have really strong executive function skills, you can shift freely from one thing to another. So for example, if you come into work with a list of things you want to do, and all of a sudden everything breaks loose and nothing that was on your list is going to get done because you have to deal with an immediate emergency, you're able to reorganize and shift things around and take care of what needs to be taken care of in the moment and worry about reorganizing what your list was. But we also have that flexibility internally, and we have cognitive flexibility, your ability to move from different mindsets, from different problem-solving sets to another. So those are all things that have a very strong play in oral language. So if we were to say, okay, Joan, what exactly are the connections? You talked a lot in conceptual information, but what does it look like in the real world? So when we look at executive functions in oral language, it's hard to comprehend large chunks of language, and it's difficult to follow lengthy or complex directions. And it can be shown as difficulty with organized, cohesive, expressive language. Also, oral language difficulties with respect to executive function can have something to do with maintaining conversational topic. You know, we joke around a lot by saying, "Ooh, there's a squirrel," when you say something and switch your topic and then switch your topic because of what's going on around you. But maintaining conversational topic is a really important skill and does not come naturally if you do not have a strong executive function. Difficulty with rapid retrieval of language or online communication, and difficulty with flexibility. Now, this is what I've been thinking about a lot. Flexibility, not just cognitive flexibility, but phonological, morphological, semantic levels of language process and knowledge. So we have seen here at the Summit School, there's a small percent of our children who are very deeply dyslexic, and very, very hard for them to move along those phonological, phonics, and orthographic targets. And when we also look at their executive functions, we also see that they're not very cognitive flexible often. And so I really do believe that we look at the flexibility in the executive system as having a play on not just cognitive flexibility, thinking differently and alternatively, but I also think it has a strong play in reading, decoding, as well as in spelling, and certainly in their ability to write and write with the flexibility of language that they need. There's also difficulty with using language for problem solving, whether it's real life problem solving or whether it's a math problem that they're trying to solve. What's another way to do that? If one way doesn't work, how can you do something differently to get you to the end? You have a really strong makerspace STEM program here just for that reason, because it's important for kids to really say, this is not working. What can I do differently? And how can I have the confidence to do something differently? And how can I use language to help me do that? Difficulty attending to language details. A lot of times children are more of a Gestalt comprehender. Difficulty with simultaneous processing of language. And that goes way back to the working memory issue, so that it's hard for them to stay present in a real perky discussion, hard to take notes, hard with multi-character movies or novels, hard with novels that have flashbacks. And then definitely we know that there's difficulty with initiating, planning, generating, and sequencing ideas, and certainly embellishing and refining written language. So this is what oral language difficulties look like in school. And you know, a conversation like this couldn't be a conversation without a picture of the brain, but that would be another 5 to 10 minutes of explanation. But it's just nowhere how closely related and the interrelationships are with receptive language moving to expressive language in that planning center, the frontal lobe of the brain. And these are very, very closely related, and a disruption in one will feed into a disruption in another. So now let's look at executive functions and academic content specifically. I kind of touched on this before, but when we look at reading language arts and we look at decoding, fluency issues can be a part of the child who has executive function difficulties because they cannot maintain that stamina, they cannot maintain that sequence. Definitely, we tend to see scattered phonics skills and flexibility of phonics knowledge. So when children come to us like in 6th grade, because they've done fairly well in early elementary, and their reading is okay, when we really dig deeply, we see that their phonics knowledge is not that strong, that there are lots of holes. And we also see that flexibility of morphological knowledge. So that when you look at words like thankful, thankfully, and thanks, to have children put those words in sentences for children that don't have that flexibility of morphology, those sentences are not that different for them. And if they really had that flexibility, their sentences would reflect their knowledge of the differences with those derivatives on there. Comprehension difficulties are also seen. We know that the working memory plays into this, but we also see it's difficult to sequence events. It's difficult to have that memory for details, and it's also very difficult to summarize. If you can't remember the gestalt of the details, it's very hard to summarize. And if you're not organized in your oral language, it's very hard to organize. And then spelling difficulties in spontaneous writing. Children may have difficulty with math, and I talked to you about that. They may have difficulty with retrieving math facts, but specifically with executive functioning difficulties, it's more the processes of math. It's not necessarily understanding the math concepts. It's more with the math mechanical issues, remembering the sequences, and remembering and looking at word problems and figuring out what is it I'm being asked to do in that word problem. We talked a lot about written language, and specifically with executive functioning, I think that's most well recognized that these children struggle with written language, whether it's restricted productivity because of sentence fluency, because they can't embellish, whether it's because they struggle with idea generation, or whether it's difficulty with weak initiation of tasks because they can't get a topic, they don't know where to begin, and weak organization. And I didn't want to not say something about science and social studies, and all of those oral language organization pieces and the written language organization really play out in science and social studies, especially when the child is asked to acquire a lot of knowledge from reading as opposed to explicit instruction. We also see that it's a real balancing act to teach children who have executive functioning difficulties. And so when you're charged with learning discrete tasks and specific content against looking at all of the processes that children have to be able to balance, it can be daunting. So when we talk about strategies to ensure what's called a frontal lobe friendly classroom, and that was Chris Kaufman, who passed a few years ago, but has a wonderful book on executive function in the classroom. There are specific ways in which you can have a classroom where you are really playing to the child's strength and really setting the child up for success. So to end our conversation, I did want to show you some examples of morning and afternoon routines, visual routines, verbal cues, and graphic organizers that help children understand what's expected of them and how to move through a sequence of things. So just let me see what's going on here. So this is an example of a morning homeroom. So for children who just don't remember, it's important for them to start independently. So one of our teachers pulled together a morning routine with word and picture cues. And it was beautiful to see the children come in, get their little cue card, and they would just move through the cue card and be ready to learn. Our teachers do a lot with reading comprehension, but with a lot of visual cues to help kids make connections with what they read. We use a lot of Kylene Beers and Bob Prost's strategies, and we make them visible to children because children aren't always going to remember. They're not going to remember all of the options. And certainly if you look at the strategy with make a prediction, ask a question, we also help them with the sentence starters, because when our children can't retrieve or can't organize, giving them that little bit of scaffolding helps them understand, get into the text, and be able to talk about the text. And if they can talk about the text, they're more likely to understand it. We also feel that it's important for kids to understand story grammar. This is one way to understand story grammar. There are other models out there, but for the little guys, we actually have a braid that they go through to understand the markers of narrative grammar. And then when they get older, the poster is good enough, but it really helps keep them on task. And so when a teacher says, what's the initiating event? They don't have to go back, retrieve, think about it. That visual array is there for them to engage in the conversation and really pull the meat out of the text. We also will use story form for our older kids, but having them remember all of the all of the pieces and parameters of story form is hard. So you would find this as a poster in their classroom so that they can understand the components of story form and what each of those forms, those parameters mean. Once again, here's we use this for nonfiction reading, and once again, having a visual array so kids can understand it. And then down here, you'll see the visual array, and then we ask children to do something with it. So when you're reading, can you find one of these notes and notice and put it down there so that you're actively looking at your text and learning. Once again, these are very helpful for kids. 4 types of questions right there: author and use, think and search. It helps kids think deeply, but it also helps them understand. We also have arrays for helping kids to remember how to do addition and subtraction problems. We also have visual arrays for the code. So if you use phonographics, you can see flexibility of the code, which is really important. So children might not understand all the ways to code the E sound, and having that chart is really important. We also integrate oral language into our classrooms, and we know that it's hard for kids to sequence. So if we want children to retell, we give them a frame to help them organize their thoughts, and in time they don't need the frame. It's also difficult for kids to tell us words that they know, to define words, and so we give them frameworks to help them do that too. We also use the Empower Writing process, Bonnie Singer and Anthony Bashir, and it's based on a few graphic organizers for specific expository writing tasks, and children learn how to look at a prompt and put all of their information in a visual array and then speak from it. We use this for writing, but the beauty of this too, it helps our kids with studying, especially in science and social studies. So, you know, when people say, well, how long does executive functions persist? Is it lifelong? Is it done at a certain point in time? Well, we know that the executive systems really seem to mature around age 17. You'll really see a real nice bump with some kids. And then other times you won't see it until age 25 or 30. But certainly there are people who really do struggle with executive function, and they need coaching or a life partner with a great frontal lobe system and a lot of love. So I have brought you through a real whirlwind of executive function. If you want to learn more, the Dyslexia Foundation will be hosting a conference in October at Massachusetts General Hospital. We are planning to go in person, but we might go virtual depending upon how things are. But if you go to yesread.org, you can see all about it, and you will learn more in depth about the issues of oral language and executive function. On your handout, you can see some of my favorite books. And then you also have a list of articles and resources. And now I'd love to answer questions. Okay, so the first question I see, it says, is there research to support the relationship between oral language and executive functions? Yes, there is. As I said in the beginning of the presentation, when we first started talking about executive functions, we really talked about it with respect to traumatic brain injury. But now at this point, we're really understanding executive functions in all facets of life. And my area of interest is how it affects school. So there is research to support this relationship. On your resource list, check into Berninger et al.'s, Drabume's, Cutting, Paul's, and Singer and Bashir. And those will really give you some more in-depth information about how oral language interweaves with executive functions. And then if you really want to go back to the beginning, landmark publication is by Vygotsky in 1962, Thought and Language. And that really kind of sets the stage for understanding the relationship between thinking and language. All right, so another question is, why do the examples for teaching children with oral language and executive function issues seem rubric-based or visual? So it's acknowledged that a hallmark of executive functioning difficulties is weak working memory. And so we know that speech is fleeting in nature, and you hear it and then it's gone. So if your working memory is weak, you can't hold much verbal information in your central executive buffer, and so you forget. Therefore, the visual helps to keep the verbal information very clear and very present for you. And so we always have visual arrays for children, visual arrays for things that are important for them to remember. If we have them remember it on their own, we don't want them remembering it incorrectly, like how to do long division, or how to divide fractions, or thinking about what other letter combinations can make the E sound. So that visual array is really, really important, and it helps kids with repeated practice internalize the information that the visual array holds. There's another question. How can teachers get a sense of oral language organization difficulties in children with executive functions difficulties? And do all children with EF difficulties struggle with organization of oral language? So I'm going to answer the second one first. Not all children with executive function difficulties struggle with organization of oral language. But I would say that more often than not, children do struggle with writing because there are so many more layers to writing than there are to oral language. But for teachers to understand children with oral language difficulties that could be contributing or part and parcel of their executive function is you listen to the quality of their language. When you have a conversation with them, are you scaffolding? Are you filling in? Are you helping them with word retrieval? Are they using a lot of non-specific words like thing thing, or just not able to name the concept or say, you know, I forgot what that's called? Are they unable to give you a solid definition about something that you know they know? And do they start to say something and then kind of forget their train of thought? So you look at the quality of language and you think about the child who's really skilled with oral language in the classroom, who's really very verbal, and you look at the child who isn't, and look at the differences, and you can start then to look at the gradations in between, and also understand how do those oral language pieces play into the written language. All right, the next question is, can I elaborate more about my thoughts on cognitive and linguistic flexibility and difficulties with dyslexia and spelling? Yeah. Yeah, I've been talking to some researchers about this. We know that there is a certain amount of, a certain percentage, a small percentage of people with dyslexia who, despite the best instruction, the most science-based instruction, the most intensive, really do not gain the reading skills that they really would hope to gain, given the fact that they're intellectually, there's no reason why they should not. And so I look at this whole notion of flexibility, being able to understand that with one sound, it can be coded with many different letter combinations, and then understanding that, and then going to, well, if it's spelled one way in the middle of the word, it's spelled another way at the end of the word. So it's that flexibility, learning something, and then being able to take that information and change it in some way to acquire a new skill or to refine a skill. And as I said before in the presentation, when I look at some of my children who's really struggle the most with dyslexia, I also look at their level of cognitive flexibility, and it's really hard for them. And there is some research to support that. And look in the resources that I gave you on the PowerPoint, and you'll start to see some of that information. Another question is, do all children with language disorders struggle with executive functions? That's a good question. I would think if you look at some of the information on specific language impairment, which now people are more looking at as developmental language disorders, more and more the information is coming out that children who struggle with language also struggle with executive function, and there is also neuroscience to support it. Specifically, Dr. Lori Cutting has done a lot of work in this realm. So I would say it's really hard to look at a child who has a language disorder and not to see some difficulties with their executive system. And then one final question, do students with executive functions who struggle with math have dyscalculia? That's a great question. Dyscalculia is starting to come into its own in terms of the research and in terms of the clinical understanding and the academic understanding. But still, when you go and you search out the definition for dyscalculia, it can be very narrow and very broad. So to me, dyscalculia is that real inability to understand numerosity, real inability to understand the relationship among numbers. For kids who have dyscalculia, they don't have a good sense of number sense. They can't make good number judgments. Base 10 is such an enigma to them. And so if they don't understand how to group numbers, if they don't understand base 10, then all kinds of mathematical thinking is difficult. When I look at children with executive function who also struggle in math, the differential diagnosis, I like to say, is, do they understand math? Are they good math thinkers? Can they arrive at the correct answer? Maybe not using the algorithms, but is it that they just don't remember how to do long division, or they just don't remember how to divide fractions? Is it that they can't look at that word problem and pull out the important pieces and figure out how to sequence that information to address the problem-solving process? So I would say maybe some children with executive function exhibit dyscalculia, but I think most of them do not. I think it's more of the executive function of organization, planning, sequencing that is more of their difficulty. The last question is, how can speech-language pathologists serve as a resource to children and teachers with respect to executive functions difficulties? Well, we just talked a few questions ago about understanding that when children with language disorders are really looked at deeply in terms of how they process language, how they internalize language, their language knowledge, and how they use language with respect to their processing, and then how it's displayed with reading, with comprehension, and with writing. I think having a speech pathologist as a resource in the classroom, or at least in consulting with teachers, can really help educators understand those deep levels of language that are not part of a curriculum of typical general elementary ed or even special education. The partnership between a really well-trained reading teacher and general education teacher and a speech language pathologist can be so powerful for children. And so I have benefited so much in my work with teachers, and I encourage all of you in whether you're in the education field or in the speech language field to find a friend in the other field and form a partnership, because your knowledge will just grow exponentially and your ability to help children will just grow beyond means. So I want to thank you. It has been a pleasure. I hope that I have given you something else to think about, and when you look at children and when you look at what you're going to teach, you think of things in a little different way. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and have a great day.